Good evening and welcome to another episode of Territories Talk. I'm your co-host, Shaina Smith Archer, welcoming you to our informative and exciting conversation. It's been a while. We're actually off schedule, so to speak, because March had 5 Thursdays and one of our guests was only available today. So we are happy to be here, be joining our OT family. And as you see, I'm with my OT family. So Chris, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening to Territories Talk family. Good evening to the hundreds and thousands of persons who are now regular viewers, whether you are in Bermuda, Cayman Islands, Anguilla, Montserrat, Virgin Islands, Turks and Caicos Island, Antigua, St. Kitts and Nevis, wherever you are in the region, we thank you for viewing us. We want to thank our media partners, which is CMR in Cayman Islands, Channel 82 in Bermuda, Radio Turks and Caicos in Turks and Caicos Island, ZJB in Montserrat, and PJFE in Saba. And of course, we have persons who are tuning in via Facebook and YouTube. So we want to thank our previous guests as well, Miss Marla Ducaran and Mr. Johan Moxham of Cayman Islands, because they our last episode, which was 3 weeks ago, spoke about EU blacklisting, unfair blacklisting in the EU that affects islands throughout the Caribbean region, islands and the economies throughout the region. And that gave back some wide feedback from across the region. And we will get some of them back on to further talk about the unfair and unjust blacklisting. So tonight we have a double header for you tonight. We are going to be speaking about two important topics. The first important topic is the health of our people, and specifically tonight, the women of the Caribbean. And then we will be speaking about climate resilience and environmental protection, because no matter how much money you have, if your health is gone and the environment's gone, the money can't bring that back. So tonight we are pleased to have our guests from the island of Antigua and Barbuda, Dr. Darini Frame. Good evening, Dr. Ephraim. How are you? Thank you for joining us.
I'm doing okay. How are you?
All right. And I will allow you to introduce yourself to the people of the region and tell us about yourself and about Ephraim Medical Center, sorry.
So my name is Dr. Darini Frame. I am an obstetrician gynecologist now for about 9 years. I practice at the local hospital here in Antigua, the Mount St. John Medical Center, and I own a private clinic, a private gynecology clinic, a clinic dedicated to women's health that is called the Ephraim Medical Clinic, currently located in Lower Gambles in Antigua.
Okay. And so, doctor, can you tell us, in your professional experience, what are some of the top 3 or 4 medical issues, health issues that women in the Caribbean are encountering?
Well, one of the major issues that women are encountering are what we call the NCDs. That's a big category of diseases, the non-communicable diseases. And here I'm specifically referring to 3 major conditions: obesity, high blood pressure or hypertension, and diabetes. For whatever reason, these 3 conditions continue to plague women in the Caribbean, and they continue to constitute a major health burden for practically every single health ministry in the Caribbean. Millions of dollars have to be pumped into the healthcare system every single year to control these diseases. And it's simply a question of lack of prevention in the first place to prevent these diseases from happening. And secondly, an unwillingness to treat these diseases once they are established. What do I mean by that? Most Caribbean women tend to eat badly, not exercise, and carry too much weight. Okay? So here in the Caribbean, I think culturally we have a tendency to eat too much salt, too much sugar, and too much saturated fat. Okay? So recently, in the last 15, 20 years, there has been a change in perception, and you find that more Caribbean women tend to eat well, in the sense, not in terms of amounts, but in terms of the types of food that they are eating. They would tend to ingest more fiber, tend to ingest more fruits and vegetables, and to cut down on the things that I just mentioned: salt, saturated fat, and sugar. But still, in many situations, you find that there are women who tend to eat too much of these three nutrients. And as a result of that, you're going to find a very high prevalence in the Caribbean of hypertension, of diabetes, and of obesity. Now, these conditions in and of themselves create a major burden for the healthcare system. But when they have been established in the individual for quite some time, they tend to lead to major complications. So many times we say, oh, that person has high blood pressure, so what? Well, that high blood pressure can cause a stroke. That high blood pressure can cause a heart attack. That high blood pressure can cause kidney failure, and then the patient has to go on dialysis. Okay, so the patient has diabetes, so what? That diabetes can damage the nerves in the eyes and cause blindness. It can damage the nerves in the lower limbs and result in an amputation. It can damage the kidneys and result in kidney failure that, you need dialysis. Okay? So there is a major health burden when it comes to these conditions. What I find is that women in the Caribbean tend not to want to undergo the lifestyle modifications necessary to prevent these diseases from happening in the first place. So there is always some sort of pushback in terms of changing the diet, in terms of exercising more, and in terms of eliminating, certain other lifestyle conditions which may predispose to these conditions. In addition to that, the other alarming thing is that, I'm not sure about in the other territories, but here in Antigua, there is a tendency, once these diseases have been established and they have been diagnosed in the patient, there's a tendency not to want to take the necessary medications to control these diseases. So you will find that even if you have an NCD, even if you have hypertension or diabetes or something like that, it can be controlled if you consistently take your medications. But what we find here is that a lot of people do not want to take the medication. So someone might have blood pressure that is sky high, but you prescribe some medications for them to take, and they probably take it maybe a week, maybe two, and then they stop. Because the thing that they say when you question them, well, why did you stop taking your medications? Oh, I don't like taking pills. Or I don't like, injecting my insulin. I prefer to drink some garlic or some lime juice or something to that effect. No, nothing is wrong with garlic, nothing is wrong with lime juice, nothing is wrong with these natural remedies. But there comes a point in time where medications just have to be taken to control these conditions. Right? So the NCDs, I would say, are one of the major health concerns in the Caribbean right now, and one of the major burdens on the healthcare system, practically in any Caribbean country.
Okay, thank you for that summation. I think the unfortunate part about us as in Caribbean people, as we've gotten more prosperous, I guess you would say, we now import more food, and in importing this food, we're importing stuff that's been preserved with God knows what. And I find it funny when people say, "Oh, I don't like taking a pill," but you're eating all this stuff that you have no idea what's in it, but it's not any good for you. So I just want to thank you for that brief overview and would like to invite you to be a regular contributor to the show because we need to educate ourselves and our region about this issue because too many of our people are, as you said, ending up in dialysis or amputation or not just women, but having strokes, and especially black men, because I mean Caribbean men, I should say, because um, we just as you said, we think we know it all. I'll drink some bush tea, and that will make it better.
Yeah.
Another issue that is affecting us tremendously, and this is specifically for women, are the what we call the gynecological cancers, particularly cervix cancer.
Mm.
This is another, in first world countries like the US and, most of the Western European countries, cervix cancer in terms of its prevalence has now fallen. So the prevalence of cervix cancer has now fallen dramatically. That means that, when you look at the population, if before you used to have 10% of people with cervix cancer. Nowadays, it's probably like maybe 2, 3%. And the reason for that is because of proper screening. Okay. Here in the Caribbean, I think in most countries, screening for cervix cancer is available in the form of pap smears. It is available in the form of pap smears. I think in most Caribbean countries, most of the district clinics, perform pap smears. But still, we find women who, you might ask them, have you ever done a pap smear? And the answer is, what is a pap smear? So I think a lot more education and a lot more programs like these, like Territories Talk, need to be done in order to get the information out there to women. Just today in office, I saw a 32-year-old female who comes in because she has what we call postcoital bleeding or bleeding after intercourse. Now, this is an alarming sign, bleeding after intercourse. And this young lady, when I questioned her, 32 years old, when was your last pap smear? Her first and only pap smear was a month ago, and she's awaiting the result. And she's 32 years old. Now, this young lady should have been having pap smears since age 21, but somehow, she didn't. So this is alarming to me and to most healthcare workers when we look at the incidence and the prevalence of cervix cancer in our society, and this is throughout the Caribbean. It is quite alarming, right? And it is also a major health burden on all of the ministries of health, right? So this is another problem that we need to tackle in the Caribbean. We need to get more women screened. We need to educate more women about the importance of the pap smear, what it is, what it does, and what is its importance in preventing cervix cancer.
All right. Well, doctor, I want to thank you for that brief introduction, brief interview, and like I said, we would like to invite you to contribute to the Territories Talk more often.
My pleasure.
All right. Any final closing words to the people of the Caribbean, to the ladies especially?
Well, what I would say to the ladies is go see your doctor. Okay? Don't stay at home. Don't relax for 10 years. You need to see your doctor regularly. At least once a year, get a checkup. Go see your general doctor. Go see your gynecologist. That checkup could save your life. It could detect something early, and early detection is the name of the game in most diseases, right?
Mm-hmm. All right. Any final comments from my co-host?
No, only to concur. Like I was sharing with you guys before the show started, that I recently did a show about women's health, but we were talking about the holistic nature, the importance of mind, body, and spirit. So I concur with the good doctor that we definitely need to take care of ourselves as we take care of our families, because oftentimes, we get so busy in our different roles that we tend to neglect ourselves. So definitely we need to do that. So I always get mine around my birthday so I don't forget Chris. So But
Good
Becky
practice.
minded. Yeah.
All right. Anything from you, Eden?
Now, I very thankful for him being on the show, and I think this is we have to take advantage of the advancements being made and the ability to get these tests now. It's really been being pushed heavily in Cayman Islands in the last couple of years about pre-screening, early screening, things that can be detected through blood tests and everything like that. So I think that is something that really, that ability to diagnose is something that people really need to take advantage of, men and women. I have to keep up on my health checks as well, and I think it's important for keeping things, nipping it in the bud and not letting it become something worse. So thank you for being on the show and sharing that information with us.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right. Thank you. So, Doctor, we'll be talking, and we'll see you soon.
All right. All the best.
All right. Thank you. And now, Eden, you are our chief advocate for protection of the environment and climate resilience, and I'll leave it to you to now introduce our guests and the topic for tonight.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Chris and Shaina, and thank you so much to the viewers for tuning in. Our guest tonight, Deputy Premier Walter Roban from the island of Bermuda.
Good night, everyone. Good night. Nice to see you all and finally meet all of you officially on Territories Talk.
All right. Thank you for being here, Deputy Premier. And Miss Angela Burnett-Penn, the author of the Irma Diaries from Virgin Islands.
Hi, a pleasant good evening to everybody across the listening audience. It's a pleasure to be here this evening.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. And Miss Lisa Hurlston-McKenzie from the Cayman Islands, a climate consultancy professional, and currently at work with the Ministry of Sustainability and Climate Resilience.
Her name looks familiar, Eden.
Her name and her face look very familiar to me too.
Good evening, everyone. And my face and name is familiar because I am Eden's first cousin, one of several that he has here in the Cayman Islands and across the globe.
Are you from the Best Way as well?
Indirectly, yes.
Okay.
I'm not currently in West Bay, but I certainly hail from there.
All right. Well, Eden looked further, and was he that happy?
There he is.
I don't know I think I might have an internet issue.
Okay.
And tonight's show is on climate resilience and environmental protection. And just a huge thanks to these three experts for coming on and lending themselves to this panel.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
So over to you, Eden and Shaina.
All right. So, Eden, you could kick off with the questions, and I'm coming in right behind you.
Okay. One second. I'm definitely... Hold on one second. I'm having some internet issues here.
Okay. All right. I'll start.
Sorry about that.
You coming right behind me.
Yeah.
All right. So let's go back out. Okay. So to anyone on the panel, let's start off by explaining what is climate change and why should we be paying attention to what is happening currently with our climate?
I'm happy to perhaps start an answer. I'm sure others here. And I thank you for referring to me as an expert. I consider myself to be obviously a policy person, because that's what we politicians are. Ministers are usually development of policy. But I rely on some very smart people to advise me on these issues. So I'm not the exclusive brain trust of Bermuda on all things climate. But I am the chief, obviously, policymaker in the government around these issues. But I would say that climate change is essentially the long-term changes and impacts in temperature and patterns of weather and the behavior of our natural environment and how that is changing around us, and the impacts of human intervention or human activity, as well as perhaps not just human but animal activity on these patterns. And that's essentially, to some degree, in a succinct way, what climate change is: the impacts of all these natural, unnatural, human, and animal impacts on weather, ocean behavior, even terrestrial impacts on the environment, and how that shifts over time.
Okay. So because things basically are moving away from what we would consider its natural cycles or natural patterns, and in a very negative way, this is why we have to start to pay attention more closely, I would say. Because sometimes, you would hear persons reference that things won't always stay the same. But, I'm sure or other experts on the panel will explain to us, that the trend data says that things are consistent for long periods of time before they start to shift for a reason, and not even about that. So last year we started to hear about the importance of 1.5 to stay alive. I don't know if Angela or Lisa want to tackle that and explain to us what that is about.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, and I'm sure Lisa wants to contribute as well. Before I answer that question, though, I just want to add a bit, if I can, to the definition of climate change, or maybe reiterate important parts of the definition. Firstly, emphasizing that when we're saying the term climate change, we're really talking about long-term shifts in our climate system. So in the basics, really starting with a change in temperature, that's the primary driver. But then that affects other things. It affects our rainfall patterns. It affects our experiences with extreme events. And when we're saying long term, we're talking about at least a 30-year period. So we're not talking about changes, month-to-month changes, even year-to-year changes, or even decade-to-decade changes, but several decades, 30 plus years. The other important point, I think, to stress is that we're talking about changes that go beyond natural variability. So there's always going to be some degree of variability in the climate system, but climate change is human-induced, and it is beyond that natural variability. So I wanted to stress those two aspects of the definition, which I think are really important. And in terms of the 1.5, maybe it came into more popular circulation in the last year, but this phrase, this saying has been around for a very long time now. I've been in the climate change circle for about 14 years or so. And I think from the time I entered the field, starting with small islands like the Caribbean, the islands in the Pacific, that chant was there. And I think it's been echoed, it's been amplified over time. And I think the recent report by the IPCC, the special report that looked at the impacts of 1.5 degrees sea rise, perhaps brought more credence and international attention to the significance of that 1.5 degree rise, but it has been there for a long time. And why that slogan, 1.5 to stay alive? It doesn't mean that a 1.5 world is safe or ideal for small islands in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and even developing countries by any means. For example, even in a 1.5 degree sea rise scenario, we're looking at significant losses to coral reef systems and other systems that sustain us. But what it does mean is that anything higher than a 1.5 degree sea rise will bring us into a major shift in our climate system that would really be disastrous for Caribbean islands. So I'll stop there for the moment. There's a lot more I could give in terms of data and science, but I want to give Lisa a chance to respond as well.
Thank you, Angela. And I can't really add too much more. My starting point was exactly where you started, which was from about 2009 on the heels of or just before the Copenhagen COP in 2009. The 1.5 to stay alive Caribbean slogan had been bantered about. We had a lot of different campaigns with very iconic faces on them, as well as musical items backing that campaign to really get it out there to the larger, more industrialized countries in particular at the COP. Why 1.5 and not the 2 degrees that was being discussed then, and only got into the Paris Agreement some 5 or 6 years later, was really critical to small islands across the globe, not just in the Caribbean. And then, as Angela said, with the more recent IPCC report, but probably also to a few years preceding that, the IPCC special report on the impacts of 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees, to really hone in on why that 0.5 degree, and that's of course a global average, is so critical, and what that can signify in terms of the difference between those 2 targets. And hence, in terms of the 1.5, as Angela rightly said, with small islands being on the front lines of climate change, what that means for us is has to be put into relative perspective in terms of where we are at the moment. We have current warming globally of 1.1, almost 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, so above the levels that they were at in 1850 or thereabouts. And that means that the region has witnessed some of the impacts that has been spoken about by the 2 previous speakers, but not least of which increased episodes of coral bleaching, more rapidly forming and longer-lived major category hurricanes, carrying with them higher wind speeds and more rainfall. We've seen, as a result of this, the temporary and even permanent quote-unquote climate refugees due to these monster storms affecting migrations of people from parts of the BVIs and Bermuda after Hurricane Irma, which I'm sure Angela will talk to us more about, in 2017, but also the Bahamas after Hurricane Dorian in 2019, just to name a few examples. And one statistic that particularly struck me recently was that in the last 10 or 12 years, there's been roughly 8.5 million people across 21 Caribbean countries that have been displaced as a result of some climate or weather-related impact.
Wow.
So these climatic changes to date have already started to culminate into what we could consider major impacts to our developmental processes and any sustainable development gains that we may have made over the last few decades throughout the Caribbean region. And climate change is expected to continue to affect, or maybe even reverse, things such as poverty alleviation, food and energy security, equality, and other dimensions of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda that many countries may be working toward. So what does a 1.5 degrees C climate have in store for the Caribbean? Well, it could spell up to, I believe the statistic is something like 50% more of the year is projected to be under warm spells than previously.
Wow.
And of course, as we heard in the previous segment, with the doctor presenting health-related implications such as heat stresses for human populations as well as for livestock, increasing the demand for energy-efficient cooling systems, and adaptation measures to modify agricultural and animal husbandry practices, increased risk of drought, of course, associated sea level rise threats, such as salinization of water resources, flooding, permanent inundation or semi-permanent inundation of low-lying lands and coastal areas, and erosion and pressure on various ecosystems, all that will persist throughout the 21st century, despite any appreciable reductions in greenhouse gases, because sea level rise is essentially locked in to a certain degree. And of course, the statistics from that IPCC report, as noted, was between 70 to 90% of our global coral reefs at risk from long-term degradation due to coral bleaching and other diseases, as I mentioned before. So this is why we could go on and on, but this is why the 1.5 is particularly important. And also to note, lastly, that there are limits to what we call adaptation for several key impacts discussed, resulting in what we call residual impacts. And therefore, at some point, perhaps in the near future, we will have to just learn to live with a certain amount of loss and damage as a result of climate change.
I think if I can just add one quick point, Lisa, it's important to flag, and you've done a wonderful job of outlining all of the threats and why this is so important for us to pay attention to. But it's important for the audience to appreciate, in terms of, again, where we're at, that right now, in terms of global commitment to tackling this issue, we are nowhere near the point of achieving a 1.5 degree sea rise. We're currently on target for at least a 2.4 degree sea rise, unless things were to shift dramatically. And I can't even imagine living in a Caribbean where we have a 2.4 degree global temperature rise. It would be a significantly different region, a region defined by drought, floods, severe events, extreme temperatures, hot nights, hot days, and not a Caribbean that I think any of us would find enjoyable to live in, not a Caribbean that would be economically viable, and not a Caribbean that would be able to sustain, I think, the populations that it sustains now. So this is a real imminent threat to the sustainability, the future of our island nations.
Wow, that is scary.
Yeah, most definitely. I've heard it referred to as the issue that contains all other issues, that regardless of whether we're talking about wars or pandemics or whatever it might be, all that is part of what is happening with climate change. Now, we know that you said that 1.5 to stay alive has been being chanted from since in 2009. Why still so long? We still see a lot of inaction even after the latest COP26 and people calling for more action. We saw a lot of subsidies given to more fossil fuel and more mining, even in the wake of COP26. Why have the large nations been ignoring the climate issue for so long? Maybe we can, yep.
Yeah, happy to give perhaps a stab from a governmental perspective.
Yes, please.
Yeah, it's very evident that the larger industrialized nations have been much slower to respond to this issue, irrespective of what has obviously been evident to us in the region, particularly small islands. But I think it's very clear that the economic priorities that we find that drives the interests of particularly the larger industrialized nations have, at least up until recently, not been in a position that has been greatly impacted by these issues. I think because of, and we can argue that there have been people since the 1970s at least who have been talking about the issue of long-term impacts on climate for industrial production. That we can go back to the acid rain discussions of the 1970s and 80s, of the large industrialized nations, the Rust Belt in North America, which actually was showing us how these unnatural activities were impacting climate and impacting not only climate, but health of individuals and other aspects of the natural environment around food production and public health and other issues. I mean, even out as far as us in the Atlantic, mid-Atlantic, and certainly the Caribbean region. One of the ironic things that we used to see, I think if we all remember, was the interesting sunsets where you had these so-called beautiful orange sort of visuals. But a lot of that was from the industrial production in the atmosphere. So despite our pleasure with seeing certain visuals, it was actually the product of some very toxic activity. And so then there was talk, but clearly the voices of those who were trying to communicate these issues to us weren't as loud because, frankly, the economic impacts were somewhat immune at the time. But what we've seen clearly is that the economics around the issues of climate have gotten a little bit more evident because of the wider impacts on volatile weather and other activities and things that have happened globally in our region, and even now perhaps even more sensitivities in the industrialized world with volatile tornadoes and other experiences that have impacted over the last 20, 30 years or more, the large industrialized nation, whether it be North America, whether it be in Europe, or as we go further south to South America with what's happening in the Amazonian region and throughout the perhaps tropical belt of our planet. So what has happened, I think, is that the economics, which were somewhat resilient or immune to these issues, has become clearer now. And we're seeing degradation of economic activities that are you can directly associate with climate change. The risks associated and the costs of the risks of impacts of volatile climate phenomena are beginning to actually impact in the billions and billions of dollars. It is very difficult for the industrialized world to then ignore these issues because it becomes more costly for them to operate as they experience these issues firsthand. So I think it's the economics and the economic realities has finally caught up with the climate reality. And that is why we're seeing a lot more interesting attention in recent years by these nations, because now they can actually correlate their economic prosperity with the issues around climate. That was not the case, perhaps even a decade ago. I'm not saying that it wasn't the reality, it was, but the politics and the economics of it allowed essentially those countries to set them aside and not have them as a priority. But that has changed. That has changed within the last decade. It is also, I think the advocacy around this has become stronger towards governments. Certainly here in Bermuda, it has, and certainly even amongst our Caribbean family, it has. If one recalls, we were talking perhaps 15 to 20 years ago about benefiting from much more efficient or cheaper oil from our Caribbean neighbors like Venezuela, like Trinidad. Now, what is the Caribbean talking about? Renewables and transitioning from that, even with the opportunity that had been created perhaps a decade more ago to benefit from cheaper fossil fuel. That priority has been set aside because obviously there's the politics around it, there's the economics around it, and the volatility that we've experienced perhaps in recent decades around fossil fuels as well, which hasn't benefited the Caribbean region very well. And so now we have an economic and a climate reality that we're facing. So I think that much has changed in the last couple of decades, which is why these issues are now facing us the way we are. And unfortunately, we island communities are at the front line. We're like canaries in the coal mine. We're like the and are like amphibians in the natural world, which always show the impacts before other places or other communities feel them, and that's where we are now. But I do believe that the economic reality have caught up with the climate reality. That's partly why governments are paying more attention to it now, but failed to pay attention to it in the past. So I'll stop there because politicians tend to talk too long. So I'm just going to be quiet. But I hope my answer has helped the discussion.
Thank you. I think the economic reality is a big part of the ability to ignore it, and then once it starts to hit the bottom line, for a lot of people who were able to ignore it before or willing to, it becomes much more difficult. Miss Burnett-Penn, what is your take on that? On why the ignorance across the developed countries, and how is that changing?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think Honorable Roban summarized a lot of it quite well. I think beyond the economics, though, there is a human element to this, right? I think it was summarized well in that the title of that movie, An Inconvenient Truth. Climate change has been and continues to simply be an inconvenient truth, I think, for the world. Even for those of us on the front lines, it's a truth that means that our lives are going to change. We have to do things significantly differently from how we used to do them in the past. And for the industrialized world that are the countries that are driving these impacts, it means that they have to now completely redefine their whole economic systems, their processes of production, their processes of supply. So it's a big effort that has to be undertaken to react to this. Not just at a country level, but at an individual level as well. So, changing any human behavior always takes a substantial effort, and people will always have a tendency to want to deny and ignore for as long as possible until it's finally right in your face and you can't ignore and deny it any longer. And I think we're finally starting to get to that point after a lot of science, a lot of data, a lot of advocacy. But I think it's also important for us to appreciate that we're far, far from a global commitment by all the countries, the big countries that really matter on this issue. And in particular, I want to flag that there's still, massive populations. In fact, the majority of the world's population locked up in countries that are still going through their process of industrialization, still on that pathway to try to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, to lift their populations out of poverty, for example. Countries like India and China, of course, readily come to mind, and the fact that there's still, large segments of the Indian population, I forget the percentage offhand, but a very high percentage that still doesn't have access to electricity. So you can understand there's a real incentive for these countries to take the path of least resistance, right, to get to certain economic development goals. And I think the challenge for the global community is going to be, how do we support the rightful ambition of these countries to develop, to achieve those basic aspirations, but to do it in a way that we don't destroy our global climate as a result of that. So I think the key to all of this really lies in how can we facilitate a shift to alternative energies, a shift to renewable energy. And this really played out significantly at COP26, where we saw for the first time global agreement around coal. And, there was a hope that the agreement would have called for and agreed to a phasing out of coal, but instead we were only able to achieve a phasing down. And the two countries holding out on that were India and China, for the very reasons that I just described. So I think it's now really on the developed countries, the industrialized countries that have already achieved and surpassed a certain level of development, to lead the way in terms of supporting and facilitating those countries that are trying to achieve those ambitions and have the right to achieve those ambitions. But we need, for global security and for the security of individual countries, to have that be done in a sustainable way. So I would end my contribution there and allow anybody else to pitch in. But I think we can't rest in the safety of thinking that developed countries, to some extent have now gotten it, because there's still a lot to the equation that needs to come together if we're going to, and we don't have a lot of time, very quickly turn this big ship around.
Right. Thank you. And Lisa, what is your take on that?
I would say if you are fairly new to the climate change topic, and you've, for the last few years, maybe only followed what has happened at the COPs on an annual basis, or in the immediate news cycle, you would get the impression that there has been this underlying hesitancy and that not much work has been done in terms of these discussions. But I think it's fair to say that when you step outside of the international climate negotiations at COPs, there is much more going on, particularly on a bilateral level. And you even see this showing up in COPs for the last few years, and also in COP26, as Angela mentioned, in terms of some countries trying to swim outside of the mainstream if they really feel that they need to be established as the quote unquote world leaders in certain respects. You've seen this for several years with the EU and the EU bubble, and previously the UK government when we were part of the EU to a certain extent. But this time more so with China and the US coming together and having this last minute agreement as the two largest emitters of greenhouse gases. So having their sort of agreement within the overall Glasgow Climate Pact. But as I said, stepping out of the more formal negotiations and seeing some of the countries taking initiatives on a more bilateral basis with other countries if they feel that the UN mechanisms for transfer of clean technology has not just been going at the pace that they would like to see it go to, or they have a special long-term cultural or geopolitical interest in a region, such as, for example, Canada with the Caribbean, or things happening at a regional level that may translate to some wider national impacts, such as what tends to take place in the US when they can't get their Congress necessarily to agree on national climate goals and targets, but on a regional basis, particularly along the Eastern Seaboard and with the Western states showing up in things like carbon offsetting schemes or cap and trade schemes or carbon taxes, west coast of British Columbia and some other parts in Canada, for example, that may not immediately signal on a wider scale and get into the language of things like these communiques that come out of the COPs. But other things are starting to shift, and the private sector in these countries as well are even taking the lead in certain things, in elevating the status of greenhouse gas abatement in their ESGs, or their environmental sustainability and governance structures. And in this regard, again, the EU taxonomy that's come out in the last year or so is in some respects leading the way there. And banks in London and wider England in particular that now have a target that they have to work towards in terms of these types of disclosures and reportings. So we're seeing the tenets of climate action in various different aspects and machinations that may not necessarily be driven by state actors such as national governments. They are perhaps in some cases by subnational governments and regional bodies, as I mentioned before.
Wow, that's a good segue to lead us into our next section of questioning, talking about climate financing and some of the other things that need to be done as solutions. Real quick, I just want to give a huge thanks once again to our media partners throughout the region: ZJB Radio FM 95.5 in Montserrat, Cayman Marl Road in the Cayman Islands, CBN Radio FM 90.9 in the Virgin Islands, Channel 8 in Bermuda, PJFE Saba Radio, Q93.9 FM, and Radio Turks and Caicos, FM 89.1. Thank you so much for helping us to inform and unite the Overseas Territories family. And I'll hand it back over to Shaina. Can let it help us to learn about climate financing.
Okay, thank you, Eden. I was just looking at the UN Foundation website because I know for some persons they may not know what COP is and hear a lot about COP26. So real quickly, Angela, can you explain what COP is and then explain to us now what it is climate financing is and what is it supposed to do for us? I know here locally in the Virgin Islands, we are actually in the process of reconstituting the Climate Change Fund Board, I believe it is the name of it. So that is supposed to be, I think, a way or a mechanism for us to access global climate financing. So it would be good to know what exactly that is and how we benefit from it.
Sure, thanks. I'm happy to do that, Shaina. So COP is an abbreviation for Conference of the Parties, and COP26 signifies that we are now at the 26th Conference of the Parties, and it's really the parties that have signed on to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. You'll hear that abbreviated as the UNFCCC sometimes. And this is really the international convention or law, so to speak, that governs the whole issue of how the countries around the world are coming together to try to address climate change. Under the convention, for instance, different countries have made various commitments in terms of emission targets, cutting emissions by certain time frames. And so every year the parties of this convention get together to discuss sort of the next steps, new targets, report on progress made, also look at commitments in terms of finance to those countries that are, most impacted, least developed, vulnerable countries, and small islands. Certainly small island developing states fit in that category. So segueing from that, the whole idea of finance for climate change really revolves around the simple fact that it costs a lot of money to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And as Lisa pointed out before, there are some impacts that we're not even going to be able to adapt to. We're simply going to experience loss and damage that is irreparable in some cases. But in those cases where we can adapt, it takes real dollars to do so. And in many instances, the cost of adaptation is beyond what countries, the most impacted, which tend to be the least developed and developing countries, small islands, the cost of adaptation really goes beyond what we're able to bear through our national budgets. And from a moral perspective, there's also the recognition that the countries that have contributed most to the climate change problem should really be the countries that are helping those countries that have contributed least, but are experiencing the worst impacts and the impacts most quickly to be able to adapt to those impacts. And adaptation really refers to any actions that a country can take to try to minimize or reduce the impacts of climate change to those countries. So I just want to broadly highlight before going any further that the overseas territories actually find themselves in a very peculiar dilemma in terms of the whole framework, the international framework that exists in relation to climate financing. Whereas our independent, islands in the Caribbean can actually access the international mechanisms that exist to support small islands in responding to the climate change challenge. Because of our political status as overseas territories, we cannot. And that poses an additional layer of challenge to those of us that, and it's a small group of us internationally that fit within this category of overseas territories. So to put it in very simple terms, the way that climate financing is structured under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is that you have the giving side of the equation and the receiving side. And in simple terms, again, you have developed countries on the giving side, and you have developing, least developed, small island developing states on the receiving side of the equation. Now, of course, just thinking about it in strict factual terms, as small island states or small island countries, we're certainly on the side of the equation that should be receiving funds. But because of our political status, technically we actually fall, within the group of countries that's on the given side of the equation, because we, of course, are not a party to the convention. We cannot be, because we're not an independent country. So it's really the United Kingdom that would be a party to the convention. And as of yet, unfortunately, there's been a gap where we've not seen any large scale ongoing relationship developed where we have a steady flow of climate finance from the UK, or as Lisa pointed out, when we were part of the EU, from the EU either. There have been projects, small projects from time to time, but those projects have not by any means met the significant need for climate finance. And I'm talking about several millions of dollars a year that is required for our islands to be able to adapt. So I just want to leave it there. I think you mentioned briefly the Virgin Islands Climate Change Trust Fund, and I can perhaps say a little more about that, but I want to give the others a chance to pitch into this conversation.
Okay. All right, Deputy Premier, what's happening with this as it relates to Bermuda?
Well, like other islands, we are, and particularly a part of the Overseas Territories family, we are mindful that there is a real urgency at this point for all of us to be able to constructively address the issues around climate change for all reasons that have already been stated already. And certainly I've been over certainly the last year working as hard as I can to work with my Overseas Territories colleagues to see that the issues as it relate to us in particular are properly addressed. As has been stated by the speaker just before me, there hasn't been the consistent, perhaps, funding or financing mechanisms available to all of us. Now, bear in mind, perhaps Bermuda has had a perhaps unique position in that we have, as perhaps have had the resources to somewhat finance our own efforts by and large around environmental protection, and have done a lot in that area over the years. But we cannot even ourselves just exclusively rely on our own resources, even at this point, because the issues of climate change pervade much bigger than just our one island. And we do see that it is important that as a group, all the overseas territories work together in ways to create opportunities for ourselves to perhaps leverage the relevance that we have in the bigger picture, because it does, despite, as has been described, where these sort of associate sort of relationship with the United Kingdom, and because of that, it does limit the ability for us to perhaps access wider international opportunities. It's not totally, it's not totally, I'm trying to find a word, it's not totally impossible. And because I believe that, and perhaps it's all a question of timing, right now, because the attention around these issues is so high, there is an opportunity for us as overseas territories to get our story out there and actually leverage that story with a wider global responsibility to support our own efforts to mitigate and adapt.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think we can do, together. The group, particularly in the Caribbean, command and have responsibility for a considerable amount of marine assets in particular. And with a clear understanding now of the impact that the ocean and the health and care of the ocean will have on the wider issues of climate change globally, we actually have an opportunity now to leverage our own responsibilities as ways to get the support that we need. But that will only happen by working together. And I am encouraged by the efforts that we have been able to achieve so far. There's a lot more work to be done. And I do think that by working together, Anguilla, Bermuda, BVI, Turks and Caicos, Cayman, we all working together can actually punch much more above our weight. And I think our weight, if you omit just our landmass and you include the marine assets that we actually have responsibility for, are considerable. And that's a way for us to get more support. In fact, what I have been finding recently is that whereas perhaps the United Nations was a more difficult creature for us to engage with, the UN wants to now constructively engage with us as overseas territories directly to discuss some of the resources we may need to do some of the things that we need to do. That is something new to Bermuda that we haven't seen before. And other international organizations seem to be interested, both governmental and non-governmental, to want to work with us as territories to do more around the issues that we may face. Because certainly the Paris Agreement does, we request more of particularly larger nations who are parties to the agreement to do more around the issue of the health of the oceans and the protection of the oceans. And so we know that Britain has an obligation that it needs to fulfill and actually needs the support of the overseas territories to achieve those goals. So it is an opportunity for us to leverage much more heavily our assets to get the support that we need. There has been some success, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more later. In how in achieving some additional support that we need. But I'll stop there because I don't want to preempt anyone else's comments or the discussion where I know it's going.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. Often we find ourselves too often relying on others to help us. What can we do to help ourselves and our future generations? I will start with you, Mrs. Hurlston-McKenzie.
Thank you. Wasn't sure if I had unmuted myself or not. I think just from the previous discussion, it's important to recognize that the Caribbean has always been a very resilient region of peoples, going back in our histories and our cultures of somewhat unfortunate resource use and exploitation of those resources, but born out of that and born out of those struggles have been a certain ingrained resiliency within our peoples to adapt to changing economic conditions and now climate conditions, which obviously have economic implications to them. I think in some useful way, the COVID-19 pandemic has presented lessons for us in terms of climate change and climate resiliency that we can apply. But in terms of some of the measures that we can look toward, and again, not straying too far away from the financing side of things, is trying to understand where our needs lie and where we can apply some of those very limited public funds that we have available to us, or shift them to areas where we know, where we know they haven't been efficiently or effectively utilized previously, and really taking a hardcore look at some of our policies that may have been or may be still considered to be environmentally unfriendly, not meeting our sustainable development goals or objectives, and with a clear focus in terms of what our climate adaptation and mitigation needs are. We are still working through that in Cayman with the assistance of some of the grant funding that we've received, either through the UK or through the EU that is still part of current projects, such as looking at our national capital accounts, a project that we have recently just completed, and trying to now utilize that very important and very eye-opening data in terms of what our natural systems provide to us in terms of climate protective and climate resilient services. So mangroves in particular, valued at somewhere upwards, I believe it was, of $1 billion. That's not an outright monetary value in terms of what you would go out and buy them for now, but just as trying to equate them to other economic values that we tend to place at oftentimes a higher value than some of our environmental resources and our sociocultural assets that often tend to get left behind in our decision making. Some of the areas that we are looking toward that have been spoken about by others, in particular in terms of our energy resources towards more renewables by 2037. Our national energy policy is currently in a review cycle, a 5-year review cycle, and we will no doubt be looking at that target that we have set ourselves, which is 70% renewables generations by 2037. Not yet in line with the Paris Agreement for having and our emissions by 2030, and also having a net zero emissions target by 2050. So these are the types of things that we will be looking towards to see how soon we can meet some of those, and hopefully with some of the grants that are, as I said, in existence at the moment, helping us really assess and prepare for what is truly feasible, particularly in our public sector building stock, but also in the residential sector and in the commercial sector, or through private initiatives that can be assisted by the government with the limited resources that we have. But also a very exciting new to Cayman and new to the region and new to the Commonwealth actually is the establishment of the Commonwealth Climate Growth Fund. The Cayman Islands government has committed some US $25 million in seed capital to establish this fund that will be focused on businesses and technologies to help deliver these climate mitigation and adaptation initiatives, not just in the Cayman Islands, but across the 54 member countries of the Commonwealth. And again, key to these investments will be investments in renewable energy, in the protection of our natural resources, our freshwater resources, our potable resources, and sanitation, our wastewater initiatives, food and agriculture, infrastructural hardening, and education that goes along with all of that, inclusive of social development policies and hardening the healthcare system, which some of that has already started to take place under the Caribbean Action Plan for Climate Change and Health. So some very exciting initiatives going on in terms of funding what needs to get done, within our national budgets where we can, but also at the moment still being assisted by, for the most part, grant funding that has been accessed through the United Kingdom and then through EU funds as well, as they still exist for the time being.
Thank you.
Mr.
Same
Famous.
question to you, Ms. Burnett-Penn. What can we, as persons who are on the front line, what can we do to protect ourselves, if anything at all, and protect our environment for our future generations?
Thank you. I have to say, I really, really appreciate this question. And before I answer that directly, I just want to say very quickly on the matter of climate finance that even though we are not able to directly access the mechanisms through that international framework for financing as overseas territories, it does not mean that there are not opportunities out there for us. So this is exactly the reason why we created the Virgin Islands Climate Change Trust Fund as a vehicle that would meet international standards in terms of independence, transparency, etc., as a safe place where, whether it's through bilateral arrangements, investments from the private sector, endowments, etc., where we could actually go out and basically amass climate funds from where they might be available to us and apply them for the needs locally. So I just want to say that there are opportunities out there in that regard, but it is critical that we have the right mechanisms in place that meet those international standards to be able to actually access those opportunities that do exist. So I just wanted to say that very quickly. But in terms of what we can do for ourselves, there's a lot that we can do. And maybe a timely analogy is in relation to health and COVID. We've heard the mantra over and over again that you're at so much greater risk for severe illness from COVID if you have these pre-existing conditions, right? And your risk is much lower if you don't. So in the Caribbean at large and in the OTs, we have a lot of pre-existing conditions that make us even more vulnerable to climate change. And if we were to fix structurally some things about ourselves, then we would be in a much better position. We would be at a lower point of vulnerability. So some of the things I just want us to think about in terms of our future development. And when I say development, I'm not just talking about physical development. I'm talking about development in the comprehensive sense, including how we think about our economic development. So the Caribbean for a very long time has been dependent on one sector primarily, or in some countries at best, two sectors. If you want to stretch it, maybe three sectors in some. But from an economic perspective, we need to seriously look at how do we diversify our economies and move into sectors that are less directly impacted by climate change. And that's an important thing for us to do in every OT in every country. And when we think about it from the aspect of physical development, there's so much that we do that inherently increases our vulnerability, increases our risk. And it's not just about how we build. And I think we hear a lot about how we build, about building to the right building standards, etc. I think what I want to focus on in this opportunity is where we build. And we can't just continue to develop our countries ignoring the fact that climate change is happening, ignoring the fact that we're going to have, more flood events, more severe flood events, that we're going to experience sea level rise, that we're going to have stronger storm surge. And these realities must bear on how we make decisions. We can't continue to observe old practices, for example, of just clear-cutting mangrove systems, continuing the number of impacts that we have on our coral reef systems, destroying our beach dune systems, all of the systems that are there that provide significant sources of natural defense. We need to really start seriously protecting these systems because they are our frontline defense against climate change. And if we were to try to replace those natural systems with built defenses, trust me, nobody would like to see that price tag, and it's not a price tag that any of our territories can afford. So we must prioritize protecting those systems. We must also look at where is it smart for us to build. It doesn't make sense for us to build in areas where we know the next, and as Lisa said, we're not talking about category 1, category 2 hurricanes being our typical hurricane going forward. The next time a category 5 hurricane hits, we want to make sure that we've built in areas that would be as resilient as possible to those types of events. And we have the technology now, we have the data to be able to inform smarter planning, to know that we should not build in a certain proximity to the coastline, we should not build in areas that would be vulnerable to flooding, etc. So I think we need to seriously look at enhanced land use planning. I think this is a critical area that we have really ignored in the Caribbean. We and this is not just, I think, in the OTs, but we just allow development to happen in a haphazard way. And we need to take serious stock of our ability to plan in the long term and to plan smart. The final point I want to make is that it can't just be the job of government. We have to find mechanisms to involve everybody in adaptation. Responding to climate change is everybody's business. Yes, government must be involved. There are certain things that only government can do. But if it's just left to government, we will never adapt in the way that we need to. So we have to involve the private sector. We have to find means to allow the average citizen, homeowners to be a part of the process. And important to that is finding local financing mechanisms, looking within our banking systems and other financial systems within our communities to find ways in which we can provide affordable finance to empower people to take measures within the sphere of their own properties or within the sphere of their own businesses. And I had the benefit of working in St. Lucia over the past few years with the Disaster Vulnerability Reduction Project. And they have a very novel initiative in St. Lucia, the Climate Adaptation Financing Facility, run through the St. Lucia Development Bank. And I think this is a wonderful model that we can learn from in the OTs, where essentially that facility provides affordable financing to homeowners, to business owners, to farmers, to be able to implement any number of adaptation measures. So there's a lot more that I could say on this, but I want to thank you, Thomas, for raising that question, because I do agree that too often we sort of sit back, relax, and wait for help to just rain down on us when there's a lot that we can be doing to put ourselves in a much more resilient position, even in the absence of large-scale financing pouring in. And it really comes down to the decisions that we make day to day and in every sector.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Burnett-Penn. Over to you now, Eden.
I think he froze. Yeah, I think he froze. Well, we have a question. You there, Eden?
Oh, hello? Yep.
There you are. Go ahead.
Okay. My internet is acting up for sure. We had a couple of questions coming in from the comments. And this dovetails nicely into what you were talking about with how we need to have enhanced development strategies that are taking into account our first lines of defense, the coral reefs, the seagrass, the mangroves, as far as actually being real physical buffers and dealing with climate resiliency and then strengthening our islands where we build and how we build. Sustainable Cayman is asking, what are thoughts on valuing our natural assets and delivering natural climate change solutions for our islands? And we can turn it back over to you, Lisa, to expand upon that.
Well, as I said, we can value them and have them valued, but it's how we actually then in turn integrate those into our decision-making processes. And as I mentioned in the previous segment, that Cayman has only just completed its natural capital accounts or ecosystem accounts for the years 2019 and 2020, I believe. And so this is the discussion. We have this information, as we have had with so many other types of studies done over the decades. What then do we do with it? How then do we integrate it into our decision-making processes, and particularly how do we embed climate change into all of these decisions throughout all the sectors, as Angela mentioned, so that it's one cohesive plan going forward to meet the challenges of 2030, 2050, be it sea level rise or coastal inundation from higher storm surges, having water incursion and a water envelope much further inland than in previous decades, and sea level rise on top of that. So I can't sit here and pretend that I have these answers, but there has to be a way that not just government agencies try to integrate this information in their decision-making and their planning processes at various stages of new proposals, especially for capital projects. That it is an absolute must, not unlike undertaking environmental impact assessments or environmental appraisals on those types of projects. It just has to become part of those processes going forward. Now, some may say that may add to the length of time of delivery for some of these projects, and that may be the case. But as Angela rightly pointed out, what is the cost then of not doing that in future? What might be the cost of corrective action if you haven't taken those things into account from the outset? Be it beach erosion further down the line, having to find the investment, whether it's government investment or whether it's through philanthropic capital, to try to purchase or buy or restore mangroves, to reestablish some of those natural buffers that, had you protected them in the first instance, you wouldn't be looking at something like that. And those dollars that are being used and diverted from elsewhere, perhaps even social programs or health programs, as previously mentioned, which are just as critical as the protection of our natural buffers and other natural capital assets that have been valued, need to be considered. So I don't know if the other speakers have experience in this and are at a little bit more of an advanced stage than we are at the moment in Cayman, that they can maybe speak about how they have integrated these into their processes, where have been the entry points in terms of their decision making or their business case frameworks, when such considerations are being introduced, and how smoothly that type of a process has run, and if they've seen the positive effectiveness of utilizing that type of information at a very early stage in their planning and decision-making processes.
Well, Lisa, here in the British Virgin Islands, we're essentially at the same stage as you. I think, in fact, all of the OTs perhaps went through that process of ecosystem valuation at about the same time. So we're just in the last few weeks actually in receipt of our accounts for that same period of time. But we have begun to think about how we could meaningfully use that information to impact decision-making processes, and also to be able to support a much higher level of annual investment from our, again, looking inward, looking at our own resources, a much higher level of investment through our annual budgeting cycle in relation to environmental protection, and again, respecting those critical natural resources as important defenses. So just to put the concept plainly, in the same way that you have a building, a physical building, and I think everybody appreciates that that building has a maintenance cost, an annual maintenance cost. So you have a vehicle, you appreciate that you have to service that vehicle every 6 months, and there's a cost attached to that. In the same way, the environment we have to treat it as an asset. It is an asset. It provides us services, and it has a maintenance cost as well. And that cost has been not taken into, I don't even want to say underestimated, it just has not been taken into account in our annual budgeting process. I don't know if that's the case across the OTs, but certainly I would say by and large in the British Virgin Islands, the bulk of the work that we do related to actual hands, rubber hits the road, work in relation to protection, restoration, monitoring, a lot of that work is funded through external projects, and it's time that we really up our local investment in terms of the maintenance of our environment. So part of our intention is to use those values to form the basis for what is a realistic and reasonable value that, or sum that we should be investing on an annual basis, because there must be a relationship, right, between the value of the asset and the maintenance cost of that asset. So that's just one of the ways in which we hope to utilize that information in the British Virgin Islands. And of course, to affect day-to-day decisions, there's a constant pressure of weighing the immediate economic gain you might get from a development that might impact an ecosystem versus the long-term gain you get from protecting that asset. So it's important that we have that data to help decision makers, make the right decisions that are going to ultimately benefit us in the long run.
I'd just like to have some comments on this particular matter, if I don't mind.
Definitely.
Bermuda has been doing quite a bit of work in this area for quite some time. We have over the years been able to build up a pretty robust environmental protection legislative framework. And I think that's very crucial for all islands to do, in that we must all take the time to develop strong legislative regulatory frameworks around aspects of our natural environment. Bermuda has for many decades had a very robust planning regime, which, because of our 22 square miles, has been essential to our development, and our planning regime is very strict and very disciplined. And I, as a Minister of Home Affairs, I'm responsible for both planning and the environment. And just so you all know, I have about 7 departments in my ministry. My 2 top largest departments are 1, the environment, and 2 is planning. Those are the 2 departments of my budget that one of them takes up 25% of my budget. And that's the environmental side. So we dedicate considerable of the budget that I have. In fact, actually, it's more than that. I have an $18 million budget. $8 million is to the environment.
Wow.
$2 million is to planning. So considerable amount of energy and resources in my budget is put to those 2 areas. So our planning regime is very robust. We have a very robust legislative framework around the environment. I mean, just this past legislative period, I carried through a protection order for sharks and manta rays. Also, we established a invasive species legislative framework to deal with the issue of invasive species, both plant and animal invasive species. We have other aspects. We have very robust mangrove protection, seagrass protection programs, and other areas like around fisheries, around very well-defined and very, very meticulous framework around the protection of fisheries and certain species of fish in our waters. And this has been in place for quite some years. So not saying that we have a perfect system, but it's very mature, it's very robust, and it has worked for many years. But we continue to evolve it, and we have a great issue right now with our seagrass and the depletion of our seagrass beds. So we have a program of which we are working with also the private sector. We have a great, I would say a very mature and robust partnership with our fishermen who fish in our territorial waters. They are our partners in the whole protection of our fisheries. So those are some of the things that have developed over time. It is crucial that each territory take the time to develop a robust environmental protection framework around all aspects of your natural environment. And this is not just the responsibility of the government. It is clearly something that you must get the support and buy-in from the wider community. And we have a lot of strong community support for these areas. The advocacy around planning in Bermuda is extremely robust. Our non-governmental groups, National Trust, and others are what I would call first responders to certainly planning applications. And they press the system when it comes to objections to certain type of development in a very aggressive way. And I have to deal with that all the time. I'm not directly involved with planning decisions, but I am at the end of a very well laid out statutory planning process of appeals. But to initial applications, it's very robust. We have a virtually full digital planning process now, where people don't even have to use paper. You can file your applications for planning. We have a very efficient system to deal with the planning for people who wish to do PV, solar, and other things. We have a very mature system around that as well. And our planning priorities are split right now with our latest large Bermuda plan into 3 priorities: community, sustainable development, and conservation and protection. Those are the 3 major priorities within our planning regime, to ensure that we have strong community engagement in the planning process, that the priority is for responsible development and also conservation. So there's some other things that we've had success at, which include private sector engagement, which I won't worry about detailing that now. But the main point I want to make is that each territory must take the time and energy to create strong environmental protection regulatory framework, because that will also attract the perhaps support that one needs to support not just government financing, but also wider international financing. If a international party who's interested in conservation and the protection of the environment sees what you have in place, and they see you have a robust framework, they feel that they can make that investment in assisting you with what you need to do. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Deputy. This question is for the lady from, there's 2 ladies from the Virgin Islands. 4 years ago, I traveled home to the Virgin Islands for my aunt's funeral, and the day we landed, we had to hurry over to what is now called Romney Pier. Because why? There was a long line of people getting their books signed by a specific author. Ms. Burnett-Penn, can you tell us about this event? Or no, why were so many people there?
Thank you very much, Thomas, and I still appreciate the fact that you came. So it was the launch, well, not the launch, I should say, but the book signing event for the Irma Diaries. Just for those who are not familiar with it, let me get it properly on camera. This is a book of survivor stories coming out of Category 5 Hurricane Irma, which was at the time the strongest hurricane to ever make landfall. So it really was one of these, first off global experiences. And the book had been launched in December of 2017. And when I first wrote this book, I intended it for it to just be a digital publication. And then there was such a huge demand. Everybody wanted a print copy. So that took some time. And Thomas, when you came, I think that would have been in March or so of the following year. Hundreds of persons who had pre-ordered the book were turning up to finally get their print copies. But the reason this book was written really does connect right back to climate change and all of the issues that we've been talking about tonight. And it really was an attempt to connect people in a very personal way to the issue of climate change. The whole mantra around the Irma Diaries is this idea of connect, care, act. If we can get people to connect to an issue, then we get them to care about it. If they care about an issue, then they start to finally act around it. And it was trying to really express to the world beyond what could be captured in headlines and even photos. And we say, a photo tells 1,000 words. But there's so much human experience that was bound up in Hurricane Irma that people would never know just by hearing a short news item or seeing a photograph. And I really wanted to share those very personal human stories with the world in an effort to get people to really connect, to empathize with the issue of climate change and with those countries, those peoples on the front line, to understand what it is to go through the most powerful hurricane ever experienced, with the hope that this would start to change mindsets and start to inspire action, which I'm really happy to see that I have seen that happening. I took the book across the world, really, to the US, to Europe, as far afield as Asia, sharing our stories. And I really see the impact that storytelling approach, getting people to care at a very human level about climate change can have. So the book continues to serve that mission, and it's available online if persons are interested in finding it. You can get it through Amazon as an e-copy as well. So I don't know if there's anything else you want to know, Thomas, but that's in a nutshell what the Irma Diaries is all about. And while I'm still speaking, because I know we must be winding down, I just want to quickly react to Honorable Roban and say it's really inspiring to see an example of where, a country in the Caribbean and OT has gotten it so right. I had the pleasure of visiting Bermuda, I think in my early 20s. And I remember literally pinching myself more than once, wondering if I was in a real place. It really feels like a fairy tale world in Bermuda, because they've gotten so much right in terms of their environmental protection, in terms of their planning. And you really see that strong legislative framework that he talked about. You see the investment in protection actually visibly coming through in the experience that you have in Bermuda. And I want to just use this opportunity, Honorable Roban, to encourage, a follow-up on this at the level of maybe minister to minister and technical exchange between agencies, because I think you're way ahead of the curve in terms of the other OTs. And let's see how we can get that mindset shift that is necessary. I think we're all dying to know the secret as to how you've been able to get that level of I think enthusiasm at the wider populist level in terms of understanding the need for environmental protection, preservation, for better planning regimes, etc. So I just want to make that appeal in this space for us to continue this conversation outside of Territories Talk, to see how we can learn from and emulate in some ways the Bermuda model.
Let me just say that there is no secret to it. We're happy to share our experience with our territorial colleagues, particularly OTs, as we're in this together. So happy to have that discussion with anyone around what Bermuda's doing and some of the things that we can work together on, because we are doing a pretty, we're doing a good job, but even we have a lot of room for improvement. But this comes from experience, but it also comes from learning and exchanging ideas with others. So thank you for the compliment, but we're all working in this together.
Yes. Thank you for. Sorry. Thank you for that, Angela. You also visited Bermuda just after you had the book published as well, if you remember.
Yes,
So,
that is true. And it's still as lovely as it was when I was there in my 20s. So that says a lot.
all right. Over to you now, Shaina.
Unmute, Shaina.
I'm on mute. Yes. So I was saying that I'm sure all our audiences have been enjoying this conversation. And there was one comment I wanted to bring up for Angela and Lisa. I don't know if you know this person, Ulrich Trotz, saying that he's happy to see you guys are still carrying the climate change torch. And a couple other persons have commented that, this is a very much needed conversation to help break down. Because again, as you have all mentioned, the headlines fade after a while. But meanwhile, temperatures are rising, sea levels are coming up, and it's going to continue to escalate if action, and in some cases drastic action, isn't taken. So we really appreciate you guys coming on tonight and sharing your knowledge with us and with our audiences. And we'd like you guys to give anything else you'd like to add. I love what Angela said about climate change being everybody's business. So I do hope that tonight everybody takes that ownership, that it's not something for just government to do or the tree huggers or environmentalists to take on, but that all of us should be concerned very much so as to what is happening with our climate. So starting with you, Honorable.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to be on. I just want to, in conclusion, touch on an issue that, how we started. We kind of talked about the impact. We were talking about COP and the impact that as an event had on where the globe is currently moving around climate change. I did have the opportunity to attend as head of the OT delegation to COP. I do believe that the OT presence there was successful in that we were able to have a global forum for the first time to speak and show the significance of our island communities and the importance we have in the wider picture of climate action and climate change, and why we should, as a group, have the support to fulfill our global responsibility, not only our local and regional responsibility around climate action. I do believe we had success in that, and a number of things did come out of COP for the OTs in relation to support from the UK government, but also attention from the international community, which was good for us. And also we are continuing to try and push. I'm actually attending a climate summit in Turks and Caicos next month, which I'm happy to be in the region with one of my OT colleagues to support the issue of climate in the region. So looking forward to that. But there is one particular other point from COP that found me to be encouraged. And those of you who may have attended previous COPs perhaps can contrast this with the experience in that, as was said earlier, there may be, a couple hundred governments in the world, but there are thousands of other people and institutions and organizations that, even between the governments bringing attention or stating what their priorities are, there are so many other people still out there all the time working on the issue of climate. And I think that, to me, is a great, encouraging, optimistic thing to know. And that I don't have to just rely on the governments. And I'm the leader of a government, so I'm speaking from a unique position, just not relying on myself and my colleagues and my peers around the world to be a part, to be the solution. There are thousands of other people outside of government who are actually a lot more consistent in their actions around climate. That, to me, is a wonderful thing, and it brings optimism to me. Also, the private sector attention, this is where I talked about the economics of it. the private sector presence at COPs I found to be fascinating, but also great, because what I saw were private sector entities in the finance industry and other industries actually coming with ideas and models on how climate financing could be put in place, supported for not only developing countries, but small island states, and be profitable, but also be sustainable. Those ideas were discussed at COP, and I thought that that was also a positive thing, that the private sector actually sees the investment in climate mitigation and climate action as good for business. At least there were parties there that actually were talking that. And I not only saw them, but I spoke to a lot of them myself, who are actually, to some degree, call themselves new like disciples of being just about profit, but actually now they're interested in profiting, or at least pushing investment in climate action because it's good for business. So those ingredients, I think, I'm not saying that we are where we need to be, because that's been very much outlined in this discussion that we're not, but I do believe that there's an opportunity that we as small island states, but also, not only with the investment from governments, which is needed, but also taking advantage of the private sector awareness and opportunity that's there for us to take action. So I'm optimistic that a lot of the ingredients to do what we need to do is out there. In like Bermuda, we are experiencing some of that support as well, privately as well, publicly, and we don't have time to talk about that now. Maybe at another show I can talk about what's happening in Bermuda on that end. But I do hope that all of us can work together going forward to advance what we need to do for us as territories. I'm not interested in seeing Bermuda progress. I would like to see the rest of the OT's progress as well in this space, because it's about humanity, it's about our lives, it's about our environment and our health and our communities. Thank you for allowing me to be here with you all this evening.
Thank you, Deputy Premier. And that was great closing remarks. I don't know if you're hearing it, Chris, but we definitely have to work on our Territories Talk summits, okay? Coming soon. Angela, your closing remarks, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shaina. Let me just thank, first of all, you, Shaina, for reaching out to me and inviting me to participate in what has really been a wonderful discussion, and to you as well, Thomas, and Eden for helping to host. It would be great to come back again at some point and just continue to discuss this issue, because we have to keep this issue in the conversation in the public realm. I want to use the first bit of my closing remarks to really acknowledge the gentleman who commented in the chat a few minutes ago, Shaina. I don't know if everybody knows who he is, but I certainly want to shine a big light on him tonight. Dr. Ulrich Trotz, who was for many, many years the Deputy Director of the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, as well as their science advisor. He's really been instrumental across the region, really, in terms of leading the Caribbean's response to climate change. But he's been, I think, particularly important in terms of the OTs and finally bringing us into the fold, so to speak. The OTs had been out in the dark forever on the climate change issue, whereas the other independent islands had been working on climate change for maybe, a decade or more before we got involved. People like Dr. Trotz at the center really saw it fit and important that the OTs be involved in the wider regional effort, and really took the initiative to carve out a project through special funding through DFID, which allowed the OTs for the first time to actually do anything about climate change. And that was as recently as 2007, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Lisa. So that's really the first time when the OTs meaningfully started to even talk about climate change and think about how we start to address it. And it was from that project, which Dr. Trotz led on, that we were able for the first time to put in place mechanisms, and we still have those mechanisms today. So climate change committees that continue to function in BVI, and I'm sure in many of the other OTs, or maybe even all of the OTs, we were able to develop a climate change adaptation policy that still is there. We were able to do a lot by way of education and public awareness. I think when I first entered the space, you hardly heard the term climate change used, and by the time that project closed out, you wouldn't hear a political speech that failed to reference and give significant treatment of climate change, and it's now in the common lingo. So that project was important for a number of reasons, and Dr. Trotz, I want to say, was also instrumental in the idea of the Virgin Islands Climate Change Trust Fund and working with us even beyond the close of that project to help us see it to where it is today. So Dr. Trotz, I'm shining a big light on you and wanting to say thanks on behalf of the Virgin Islands and the entire OT's family for the work that you personally did and for the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. I think the OTs have a lot to be thankful for in terms of where we're at. And just finally, on a wider note, I just want to end by saying that, as a Caribbean person, in the same way that we cannot live in this region and ignore the fact that we have a hurricane season, we can't ignore the fact that we have an annual rainy season, an annual dry season. We simply can't ignore the fact that we have climate change. Climate change is now a part of the Caribbean reality. And we have to start to think and act as if it is a part of the Caribbean reality. And I don't think that we're there as yet. And so I just want to encourage everybody to take it upon yourself, to educate yourself. There's a lot of information that's out there on the internet. We're now at a stage where the science has evolved, where we actually have a number of scientists in the region working on this issue, providing us with regional specific projections that will help us in our planning. And I just want to take an opportunity to call out some of that work that is available. In particular, and in the last 2 years or year and a half or so, we've seen the publication of the State of the Caribbean Climate Report. That's a 2020 report. And this was done by the Caribbean Studies Group, MONA, at the University of the West Indies. So again, that's the State of the Caribbean Climate Report 2020. Anybody can go online, Google it, download it. I would really encourage persons to go and inform themselves more in terms of what we can expect and what are some of the things that we can be doing in the region to respond. So I think that's really my closing note. If we thought COVID impacted our lives, climate change, the impacts from that are so many more times, great than what we've seen from COVID. And they're not temporary impacts, they're permanent impacts. They're impacts that are going to be with us and shape our future. So we cannot ignore this issue, and we have to act on this issue now. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you for accepting, Angela, and and all the work that you do here. I mean, I was sharing actually with my co-host the link to the beach management presentation you were doing last night. So, you're staying on the front line. So I encourage all of us, again, it's everybody's business and we have to stay on top of it. So Lisa?
Thank you very much. I don't know if I like the fact that I'm bringing up the rear here, but I have to echo Angela's sentiments with respect to Dr. Trotz, or Trotzy, as some of us know him as. He is my absolute hero in every single manner of life, but in particular from a professional perspective when it comes to climate change. I came to work in the climate change space some 23 years ago, and with Dr. Trotz from about 2004. And so he has been my climate change hero, my climate change North Star, and my drinking buddy for El Dorado rum. And I'm hoping now that you're retired, Dr. Trotz, that we will see you soon here again in Cayman to resume those very important interpersonal discussions. And some of the imbibing that goes along with that. But on a serious note, my thanks on behalf of all of the Cayman Islands and our National Conservation Council that still hosts a climate change committee And now, of course, on behalf of the wider government and Ministry of Sustainability and Climate Resiliency that I'm fortunate to just start working in as of 3 weeks ago. We are still looking for your guidance. I see some of it on Facebook, but also, of course, in terms of all your vast publications through the 5 Cs that Angela mentioned, which is a regional clearinghouse for much of what has taken place research-wise in the Caribbean, which has been extremely impressive. I would encourage the listening and the watching audience to go to the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center website, look at the plethora of projects that have been undertaken by our CARICOM counterparts, and also you will see there the ECAC project and the documents there that were produced, the technical documents there that were produced under that. Somewhat dated now, especially in terms of the Cayman Islands, which is why we're undertaking an update to that in terms of a climate change risk assessment that is being funded through the governor's office, with great gratitude to the governor and his staff there for making that happen for us. And stay tuned, watch this space. We will have more on that in time. But I would just like to also echo the importance of having champions in this space, not just only at the level of government or governmental organizations and within the private sector, but also within NGOs as well, even if you're just on the periphery of environmental ambit. It's not just an environmental issue. Climate change, as I think the discussion tonight has demonstrated, is a developmental issue. It's a health issue. It's an issue of energy security and food security. It cuts across all sectors. It cuts across all peoples, particularly when you're talking about small islands and low-lying coastal communities. I think we have seen with the Hurricane Ivans and Irmas and Dorians that it doesn't matter what your income bracket is in terms of a major Category 5 hurricane that has spun up seemingly overnight in a 24-hour period, or has sat and lingered over you for 36 hours. It doesn't discriminate between the haves and the have-nots, and the importance of helping each other in preparation for such events and helping each other in preparation on a community-wide scale for other types of even just heavy rainfall events that I know for us here in Grand Cayman in particular has been a chronic issue that we have been facing in certain communities and certain districts. So the importance of climate change champions within your organizations that hopefully have some sort of risk management background to them, even if it's not in terms of climate change specifically, but just starting to approach your operations on every type of level to try and identify what those risks could be in terms of external shocks to your organization, as well as specific climate change implications that relate to risk and risk management, and incorporating those as part of your normal review cycles and normal review processes. I know that that's something that some organizations that may be listening have started to do, particularly in terms of cultural assets, which we often forget about because the focus has typically been on our natural assets, our mangroves, our coral reefs, our seagrasses that, of course, help us in terms of enhancing our resiliency, some of which has been quantified. For example, in the Cayman Islands, the CRIF, or the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility, had identified that 89% of some of our physical risk from larger hurricanes, coastal flooding, inland flooding could be averted if we institute risk mitigation measures that include things like enhancing our natural coastal buffers, but as well as some hardening projects to complement those. But for the most part, the majority of that 89% risk avoidance was actually in terms of nature-based solutions, particularly along the coastline, where the majority of our risk is from water-related hazards. So I think I will end with that, with my thanks to the hosts and the producers, and that I echo Angela in that we could have another series of discussions on this, even if we just limited it to very in-depth discussions on particular sectors, because there's so much more that we could really dig our teeth into for people to really get their arms around what it means to be facing these climatic changes that are just going to get worse. We know we're already facing them, and we know that they're never going to go away. And so we just have to put on our big boy pants and big girl pants and get down to, as the Honorable Deputy Premier said, making our environmental governance structures much more robust, which thankfully we are on that road to in a much more meaningful way at the moment in the Cayman Islands. And I look forward to assisting my colleagues in the ministry and the wider government to try and effect some of those necessary governance provisions that we have been long discussing. And climate change now just gives us that added lens that we can really address these things and get the work done. So I will thank you and close there.
Thank you, Lisa. And again, it was great to meet all of you who I'm meeting tonight for the first time. And we will definitely be following up with some more episodes, I would say, around this topic to make sure that, we continue to inform and educate our people on the importance of this. So, Chris, over to you.
First of all, I just want to thank everyone that participated tonight, especially you, Mrs. Hurlston-McKenzie, for coming in at short notice. And for a lot of people, talking about the environment may not be, overtly exciting, but I could guarantee you, if we don't talk about it and we don't bring awareness, the next hurricane that strikes us, you won't get to watch anything on the internet because your roof will be gone or your infrastructure will be gone. And we have to, just like health, people don't want to talk about it, but it's the most important thing. As Ms. Burnett-Penn said, is that this is our asset. We have nowhere else to go, really. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Deputy. Thank you, Ms. Burnett-Penn. Thank you, Mrs. Hurlston-McKenzie.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Huge thanks to all the viewers, of course, for making this show what it has developed into so far, and all of our great media partners. Again, thanks so much to ZJB Radio, Spirit of Montserrat 95.5 FM, Cayman Marl Road in Cayman Islands, CBN Radio FM 90.9 in the Virgin Islands, Channel 82 Bermuda, PJFE Saba Radio 93.9 FM, and Radio Turks and Caicos FM 89.1. I think it would be great to have a show about what it would look like to see cooperative effort in the Caribbean and in the region and among the OTs, and how that could really be implemented. So maybe that might be a topic we could kick around, is how do we make this move as a people and not just as individual islands, and what might that look like, and what might some of those changes that we could make all together that we might not be able to make on our own. look like. So that might be something that we could kick around another time. This has been a great show. Thank you all so much.
Indeed.
Thank you.
All right. So until next time, just reminding everyone, if you have not yet liked our Facebook page, please make sure you subscribe to that and our YouTube channel so that every time we have an episode scheduled, that you will actually receive a reminder. And if you have any ideas for topics or shows or even guest suggestions, feel free to drop us a message and we'll be sure to get back to you. So on that note, until next time, this is Territories Talk, and we will continue to inform and unite our OT families. Have a good evening.
Love you all.
Love you all.